In the summer of 2018, a fleet of barges began dumping massive limestone boulders into the dying waters off Cedar Key, Florida. To the local oystermen who had watched their reefs collapse for decades, it looked like madness. They were watching their livelihood get buried under 500,000 tons of construction waste. The plan seemed insane. Fix a delicate biological ecosystem by brute force using industrial rock. Skeptics said it was a waste of money, and engineers said the physics would not hold. But 15 years later, the gray rock is gone, buried under a living crust of oysters so dense the limestone has disappeared. In the shallows behind the reef, acoustic sensors picked up a signal that should not exist. It was the smalltooth sawfish, a prehistoric predator functionally extinct in these waters, had returned. This is the story of how Florida did not just restore a reef, they engineered a resurrection. Before the collapse, the Florida Big Bend was protected by a reef that had been building itself for more than 3,000 years. Lone Cabbage. Reefs stretched 3 miles across the mouth of the Suwannee River, a massive living breakwater made entirely of oyster shells stacked generation after generation. This wasn't just a habitat, it was a machine. The reef acted as a hydraulic dam, trapping fresh water as it poured out of the Suwannee and creating a brackish lagoon behind it. That lagoon, with its perfect balance of salt and fresh water, was the nursery for the entire coastal ecosystem. Oysters thrived in the low salinity zone. Juvenile fish hid in the seagrass beds that grew in the clear, protected water. And along the edges, in the shallow mud flats, sawfish used to hunt, their long-toothed snouts sweeping through schools of mullet like prehistoric combine harvesters. The reef worked because of elevation. At its peak, Lone Cabbage Reef rose nearly half a meter above mean low water. During low tide, the top of the reef was exposed to air. This exposure was critical. Oysters can survive out of water for hours. Their predators cannot. By building itself tall enough to breach the surface, the reef had created a fortress. Oysters on top survived, predators stayed below, and every generation of oysters that lived added their shells to the structure, making it taller, denser, and more effective. The system was self-sustaining, until it wasn't. By the early 2000s, something had changed. The reef wasn't growing anymore. It was sinking. Not physically collapsing, but being overwhelmed. Sea levels had risen just enough, and river flow had decreased just enough so the reef no longer broke the surface at low tide. It was submerged, constantly. And once the oysters were underwater all the time, the predators moved in. Oyster drills that had been kept at bay for centuries now had unrestricted access. They swarmed the reef, drilling through shells faster than new oysters could grow. Crab populations exploded. Fish cleaned out the juveniles. Within a decade, oyster densities collapsed from more than 200 individuals per square meter to 11. 11 oysters on an entire square meter of reef. The structure could not sustain itself at that density. Dead oysters leave behind shells, which normally become the foundation for the next generation. But when mortality is that high, the shells break down faster than new oysters can cement them together. The reef began to disintegrate. The numbers tell the collapse in brutal detail. In the late 1800s, Lone Cabbage Reef produced more than 200 metric tons of oysters annually. Commercial boats would pull thousands of pounds a day from these waters, and the reef would regenerate fast enough that the harvest never dented the population. By 2010, the total annual yield from the same area had dropped to 2 metric tons, a 99% decline. The reef that had defined the coastline, that had shaped the water flow of the entire sound, was functionally extinct, and with it went everything that depended on it. The seagrass beds, starved of light by sediment that was no longer being filtered, disappeared. The juvenile fish that needed those grass beds to survive stopped recruiting. And the sawfish, which required shallow, protected nurseries with clear water and abundant prey, vanished entirely. The last confirmed sighting in the Suwannee Sound was in the early 1990s. After that, nothing. The ecosystem had crossed a threshold. The reef was too low to protect itself. The water was too salty for oysters to survive, and there was not enough shell material left on the seafloor for larvae to attach to even if they tried. The system was trapped in a death spiral, and nothing short of a physical reset could pull it out. In 2015, a research team at the University of Florida led by Dr. Bill Pine started asking a different kind of question. Everyone had been treating the oyster collapse as a biological problem: pollution, overfishing, disease. But Pine was not a biologist. He was a numbers guy. When he looked at the data, he saw something else. The oysters were not dying because the water was toxic. They were dying because the reef was too short. The elevation had dropped below a critical threshold, and once that happened, the physics of the system changed. Predators that used to be locked out now had free access. Salinity that used to be buffered by the reef now spiked during storms, creating conditions that stressed the oysters and made them vulnerable. The solution, Pine realized, was not to fix the oysters. It was to fix the elevation. If you could rebuild the reef to its historical height, the oysters would take care of themselves. The hypothesis was straightforward but untested at this scale. Raise the seafloor, recreate the geometry of the old reef, and let nature do the rest. The problem was figuring out what to build with. You could not use sand. Sand shifts, compacts, and washes away. You could not use concrete. Concrete is expensive, and more importantly, it does not provide the chemical cues that oyster larvae need to settle. What you needed was rock. Hard, stable, chemically appropriate rock. And it needed to be massive. Building a 3-mile-long reef tall enough to break the surface at low tide would require hundreds of thousands of tons of material. The team found their source in Central Florida, high-grade limestone, the same rock that forms the bedrock of the entire state. Chemically, it is almost identical to oyster shell. Both are made of the same mineral. Both have a rough, porous surface that larvae can attach to. And critically, limestone does not break down in seawater. It is stable. Once you place it, it stays. The team designed a 2-layer system. First, lay down massive limestone boulders to build the base structure, recreating the footprint of the original reef as it had been surveyed in the 1800s. These boulders, ranging from 6 inches to 3 feet in diameter, would provide the elevation and the structural integrity. Then, over the top, spread a layer of recycled oyster shells. Not fossilized shells from ancient deposits, but fresh shells collected from restaurants and seafood processors across Florida, shells that had been alive in the Gulf just weeks earlier. Early tests revealed something unexpected. Fresh shells outperformed ancient shells by a significant margin. This discovery transformed the project. Instead of relying entirely on expensive quarried stone, the restoration could be powered in part by waste. Shells that restaurants and processors were paying to dump in landfills could now be turned into the most effective settlement material available. By the summer of 2018, funding was in place. $8.3 million came from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, drawn from penalties paid by BP after the Deepwater Horizon disaster. The construction contract went to C.A. Boone, a local firm with experience in marine work, and the labor was a partnership. University researchers provided the science. Oystermen from Cedar Key, who had watched their livelihoods collapse, joined the effort, and volunteers hauled shells from collection points across the state. The scale was staggering. Over 4 months, from July to October, crews used GPS-guided barges to place limestone boulders along a 3-mile stretch of seafloor, following the exact footprint of Lone Cabbage Reef as it had existed in the 1880s. The reef wasn't built as a single continuous wall. It was constructed as 22 separate segments, each one carefully positioned to recreate the historic configuration of gaps and channels. These gaps were critical. The original reef had functioned as a leaky dam, slowing fresh water flow but not stopping it entirely. If you blocked the channels completely, the salinity balance would break. Too much fresh water would pool behind the reef, creating conditions just as hostile to oysters as full-strength seawater. The gaps had to be narrow enough to slow the exchange, but wide enough to let water through. Once the boulders were in place, the shells went down. Tons of recycled oyster and clam shells were spread in a thin layer over the limestone to provide immediate biological cues for larvae. And then the team stepped back. There were no pumps, no filtration, no ongoing maintenance, just rock, shell, and the hope that the physics would work. For the first year, nothing happened. The limestone sat on the seafloor, gray and lifeless, while currents swirled sand around the edges. The oysters that had been relocated during construction were slow to recruit. Water quality measurements showed minor changes in salinity near the reef, but nothing dramatic. The oystermen who had supported the project began to wonder if they had been sold a fantasy. You can't just drop rocks in the ocean and expect a reef to appear. Reefs take centuries to build. This was a pile of stone pretending to be something it wasn't. Then, in the spring of 2020, monitoring crews detected something. Baby oysters, thousands of them, microscopic larvae that had drifted in from offshore populations, had found the limestone and shells, settled, and begun to grow. Within weeks, every boulder was covered in a faint white film. Baby oysters, no bigger than a grain of rice, cemented themselves to the rock. By the end of the summer, those spat had grown into juveniles, and by the following spring, they were adults, filtering water and spawning the next generation. The density climbed fast. In 2018, before the restoration, the site had 11 oysters per square meter. By 2023, 5 years after construction, densities hit 222 per square meter, a 2,000% increase. But the numbers alone don't capture what had happened. The reef had changed color. The gray limestone was gone, buried under a thick, uneven crust of oyster shells. Barnacles encrusted the shells, algae grew in the crevices, and in the gaps between the boulders, small fish darted in and out, hiding from predators cruising the open water. The reef wasn't just supporting oysters, it was creating structure. And structure in a marine environment is everything. Surveys comparing the restored reef to adjacent sandy seafloor found that the reef hosted more than twice as many species and more than 3 times as much total biomass. Crabs, shrimp, snails, worms, juvenile snapper, drum, redfish. Animals that couldn't survive on sand had flooded back into the reef within months of it becoming biologically active. But the real transformation was happening behind the reef. The brackish lagoon that had disappeared when Lone Cabbage collapsed was reforming. The reef, now tall enough to break the surface at low tide, was once again acting as a hydraulic dam. Freshwater from the Suwannee, instead of flushing straight out to the Gulf, was pooling behind the structure, creating a low salinity zone. Salinity measurements on the landward side of the reef dropped by an average of 3 parts per thousand, a shift that might sound minor, but represents the difference between a hostile environment and a nursery. Seagrass, which had been absent from the sound for decades, began reappearing in the shallows. Water clarity improved as millions of oysters filtered sediment out of the water column, and with the grass came fish. Juvenile redfish, which require both seagrass and hard structure to survive their first year, were suddenly abundant. By 2023, recreational anglers were reporting catches they had not seen in 30 years. But the most shocking return came from something no one had been looking for. In 2022, acoustic receivers placed near the reef picked up a signal that researchers initially thought was an equipment error. The tag frequency matched a smalltooth sawfish. These animals, once common along Florida's Gulf Coast, had been functionally extinct in the Big Bend for more than 30 years. They require shallow, protected nurseries with clear water and abundant prey. The collapse of the reefs and the loss of the brackish lagoons had eliminated that habitat entirely. But now, with the reef rebuilt and the lagoon restored, the conditions they needed existed again. And somehow, from a remnant population that had survived in the southern Everglades, juvenile sawfish had found their way north and rediscovered water that their ancestors had abandoned decades earlier. Stand on the shore at Cedar Key today and look out toward Lone Cabbage Reef. The water is different, not clearer in the sense of being pristine, but dense. The kind of dark that comes from structure beneath the surface, from life packed so tightly that light does not penetrate the same way it does over sand. During low tide, Portions of the reef break the surface. Oysters piled so thick they form ridges, gray-brown humps of shell studded with barnacles, slick with algae, alive. This is what success looks like. Not a return to some imagined pristine past, but a functional system operating at the density and productivity it once had. The reef now supports commercial harvest. Oystermen who were banned from these waters for decades are pulling legal-sized oysters from designated sections of the reef, carefully managed to ensure the population can sustain itself. The oysters themselves are filtering water at a scale that changes the chemistry of the entire sound. At peak density, with 200-plus oysters per square meter across 3 miles of reef, the system is processing millions of gallons daily. Each oyster, depending on conditions, can filter between 3 and 50 gallons of water per day. Multiply that by the total population, and you have a biological treatment plant operating continuously, pulling nitrogen out of the water, removing suspended sediment, and reducing the cloudiness that smothers seagrass and suffocates fish. The biodiversity return has been equally dramatic. Surveys conducted in 2023 found small creature counts on the reef exceeding 10,000 individuals per square meter. These are not just oysters, they are the full complement of reef-associated life. Marine worms burrowing through the shells, tiny crustaceans scavenging organic material, mud crabs and stone crabs hunting in the crevices, juvenile fish using the structure as refuge from larger predators. The reef has become a magnet, concentrating life in an area that was, just 15 years earlier, ecologically barren. But the most compelling evidence of the reef's success is the return of animals that no one expected to see. The sawfish detections were not isolated incidents. By 2024, multiple individuals had been tracked moving through the restored areas, using the shallow lagoons behind the reef as nursery habitat. These are juvenile sawfish, animals born in the Everglades that have migrated north and found conditions suitable for survival. The fact that they are here at all means the system is working. Sawfish are apex predators. They do not show up in degraded habitat. They need clear water, abundant prey, and protective structure. The rebuilt reef provides all three. The economic value of the restoration is harder to quantify, but no less real. The oyster fishery, which had collapsed to near zero, now generates steady income for local harvesters. The reef's role in coastal protection became visible during Hurricane Idalia in 2023, when storm surge pushed into the Big Bend. Shorelines protected by the reef experienced measurably less erosion than unprotected areas, a pattern consistent with studies from other regions showing that oyster reefs can reduce wave energy by 30 to 40%. The estimated property damage prevented by the reef during that single storm runs into the millions. The ongoing ecosystem services, water filtration, habitat creation, and fishery support have been valued at over $100,000 per hectare annually. The return on investment calculated from restoration cost versus quantified benefits shows the reef recovering its construction cost within 2 to 14 years, depending on which services you measure. Compare that to concrete artificial reefs, which cost 10 times more per hectare and provide a fraction of the biological function, and the advantage becomes clear. The Florida restoration is no longer an isolated experiment. The methods used at Lone Cabbage Reef are being scaled up. Apalachicola Bay, which suffered a collapse even more severe than the Big Bend and has been closed to commercial harvest since 2020, is now the target of a $30 million restoration using the same approach. Limestone base, recycled shells, elevation engineered to match historical conditions, and across the Gulf Coast, from Louisiana to Texas, similar projects are underway. The principle has proven itself. When you restore the physical baseline, the biology follows. You do not need to reintroduce species. You do not need to manage populations. You just need to rebuild the geometry that the ecosystem requires, and nature will fill in the gaps faster and more completely than any human plan could predict. The real lesson of the 500,000-ton resurrection is about thresholds. Ecosystems are not fragile in the way we often imagine. They do not collapse from a single injury. They collapse when a critical physical structure is lost, and once that structure is gone, the system becomes trapped in a degraded state. No amount of water quality improvement or fishing restrictions will bring it back. You have to rebuild the foundation. And if you do that, if you recreate the elevation, the texture, the chemical signature of what was lost, the ecosystem will rebuild itself with a speed and complexity that no engineer could design. Florida did not just restore a reef, it proved that humans can be the starter motor for natural recovery. That 500,000 tons of rock and recycled shells, materials most people would call waste or ballast, can become the bedrock of a resurrection. The gray boulders that looked like environmental vandalism in 2018 are now invisible, buried under a living crust of oysters that are filtering billions of gallons of water, feeding thousands of animals, and providing refuge for a prehistoric predator that most people thought was gone forever. Sometimes the most advanced restoration technology is just giving the Earth back the geometry it needs to heal itself.